I'm joined today by Jess Hill, who's had more than a decade of experience as a journalist, working as a foreign correspondent for the Global Mail, and has also been working for ABC's Background Briefing. And today we're looking at online news, citizen journalism, and the use of social media in that sort of context. Jess, over that period you would have seen huge changes with media and communication devices and so on. And how has that impacted on foreign correspondence?
Well, enormously, and I remember that one of the first things that I really noticed when I arrived in Cairo, which is where I lived for about 7 months in 2012, is that the use of Twitter and Facebook, Twitter particularly amongst foreign correspondents, had really changed the way in which people did on-the-ground reporting. So by that I mean, you know, we all lived maybe like 5 or 10 minutes out of town. There were regular protests down in Tahrir Square. But you could, rather than having to go downtown as you would have before social media to see what was going on, foreign correspondents could just go onto Twitter. They could see what other correspondents were tweeting, either from Tahrir Square or from another place in Cairo where things might have been happening, assess for themselves whether it's worth their time to go and see, ask those correspondents questions, like what's happening down there, you know, get facts so that if they needed to write something back down to their, you know, news, the people that they were working for at home, that they could get some information from people that were on the ground who were just colleagues. So I felt like there was a lot more, I guess, people didn't take as many chances where I was working in Cairo. So that was a really big difference. The other difference is, of course, in how we were able to contact people on the ground. And by 2012, by the time I was in the Middle East, a lot of foreign correspondents were using Twitter and Facebook to find people in the Middle East to speak to as contacts. So, and in the Middle East, social media is incredibly popular. You know, in Egypt, you know, activists who have made a name for themselves both on Twitter and Facebook, and then, you know, in the square, they're really sort of, their whole social media personality is what they're really known for. And you'd have, you know, graffiti of Twitter birds on the walls in Cairo, and hashtags and things like that. So the presence of social media over there is much more felt in the towns than certainly in Sydney. I mean, I don't think I've seen any Twitter birds anywhere, and certainly you don't see many hashtag graffiti symbols, you know. So it was really, it was hard to extricate your experience as a foreign correspondent from the impact and influence of social media.
Some called that the Twitter revolution, and I've seen debate over whether that was overplayed, whether the revolution would have happened anyway. It was just Twitter was a way of communicating during it. Do you have any views on this?
I think that certainly Facebook and certain Facebook pages did instigate the revolution, because the idea of having a protest on January 25th, for example, in Cairo on what was National Police Day, that was first floated on Facebook pages that had tens of thousands of followers. So without a doubt, the revolution itself and the way that it started was organised and promoted on social media, on YouTube, for example. But in terms of, I mean, that's just a medium of communication. So to frame it like that is probably missing the underpinning reasons for why that's happening. And of course, there are lots of different reasons for that. There is, you know, mass poverty, the need to have the right to speak your mind, the need to, you know, the feeling of needing to be able to vote for the person that you want to have ruling your country. Those sorts of things I think are much more important than the way in which they were organised and the way in which people came together. Because, like, you know, if we were to have a revolution tomorrow and it was promoted on radio or something, you wouldn't call it the radio revolution. Do you know what I mean? That's just how you found out about it. But that's not a definition of what the revolution is. But yes, certainly it was a massive factor. But I think it dominated the narrative to the point where a lot of other important factors were drowned out.
Sure. You were working for the Global Mail at the time, you know, which was really an experiment in online journalism, and you've worked for other media, and including the ABC. What's the difference between an online-based production and traditional media, or legacy media as they're transforming now?
Well, I guess from my perspective as a correspondent, the difference between working for the ABC, where you have a guaranteed audience. I was working with ABC Radio Current Affairs as a producer. We know that we've got a guaranteed audience. The ABC is a well-respected institution, lots of listeners. But when I started with the Global Mail, I was really aware that I was going to have to play a big role in getting people to see my stories. And so that meant having to call people's attention to it on things like Twitter, where I've got a reasonable following, through things like Facebook, but really promoting myself and promoting the Global Mail as well, and not being able to just rely on the fact that we've already got an established viewership. So to my mind, it sort of makes the writer and the reporter, if they're willing, part of the business model. You're not sort of just able to contribute an article and then just wipe your hands of it, unless you're fine with, not getting much of an audience. But otherwise, you have to play a really big role in promoting your own stuff.
Well, coming down to that, I suppose it's a changing role for journalists that way, in taking on that marketing role, but they're also using social media in so many other ways. So as a social media user, well, I think at the moment you might have 16,000 followers or something on Twitter. What are the different ways you might use social media apart from marketing or pointing to your own work?
Well, that's, it's interesting you should bring that up, because I think it's actually vital for journalists to use things like Twitter for other purposes other than promoting their own work, because otherwise it's just, people see through that and they're less likely to want to engage with you. When the Arab uprisings began in 2010 in Tunisia, a couple of months later, it took a couple of months really for it to sink in with me and for me to feel just how important it was. But when the Libyan uprising started in February, I really started using social media to find people on the ground, first in Libya, then in Bahrain, and then in several other countries throughout the Middle East. And I did that by establishing relationships often with expats, who were, Libyan expats, for example, who were in America or in Europe, who had contacts back in Libya, because obviously internet penetration is very small there. And I spent hours and hours and hours building relationships with these people. So I didn't just come at them and say, "Hi, my name's Jess Hill, I'm from the ABC, can you give me an interview?" I think that's really inappropriate, especially in times of great national trauma and conflict. And so I really dedicated a lot of time to building a network base and to treating these people with respect, and winning their trust, and then moving that into a space where we could have somebody speak to us on the radio with ABC where I was working. And that was really successful, and we managed to report, I think, over about 200 original stories on the Middle East from Sydney without stepping foot in the Middle East once. So it was a fascinating, and it was an experience, and it was a total roller coaster ride, but incredible, the window that social media gave us and our listeners into what was happening during the Arab uprisings.
I'm also interested in the way social media might have changed news production in some ways, either through the use of images that have been posted to Twitter, obviously less so in radio, but perhaps some audio grabs from that. And also, with Storify, we have whole stories being told on social media. How much have you noticed it impacting on news production?
Well, a lot. It really depends on, I work in Radio National, so at the moment, I'm working on long investigative pieces. Now, for me, even after having used social media to a great extent, I don't use it so much for these long investigative pieces, but for daily news, it has a huge impact, especially, say, for example, in online news, where tweets from, be they world leaders to eyewitnesses or whatever, are used in news packages. I think also increasingly, obviously, reporters are being told that they need to tweet while they're covering certain things. Strangely, I guess, I look at Twitter, there's not that many people on Twitter in Australia. It's certainly got a broad usership, but for the amount of times that you see it on a daily basis in newspapers or in television or whatever, it's sort of not proportionate to the amount of people who actually use it regularly. But I guess it's changed fundamentally the way that we collect news because everything is there, and the citizen journalists who are capturing footage from around the world. It can be with you in 10 minutes from an event happening in Yemen. In Sydney, we can know about it and we can have it on ABC News half an hour later. You know, that is radical.
Some people are specialising now in agency-style social media news verification and distribution. Have you encountered many problems with verifying information on social media?
Yes. When I was working with ABC Radio on the Arab uprisings, we had some pretty simple rules about how to verify information, and a lot of it was just the same way as you might verify information out on the road. If you're reporting on a flood, for example, and you go and talk to a farmer and they tell you a story about perhaps what politicians are doing or aren't doing, then you don't necessarily just take that one farmer's word for it. You might go and find someone, ask their neighbour, and what experience have you had with local politicians? Are they doing that? Etc., etc. And on Twitter, it's no different. If you see something posted by someone, you don't know them, so it's then a matter of finding several different disparate sources who say the same thing. It's just triangulating basically the information, and then looking at what is being reported. Is there any evidence to back up what these people are saying? Has it been reported by anyone else yet? And then being cautious, you know. But I think what the real difficulty in terms of Middle Eastern coverage started arising was around Syria, and it felt like after a few months of I'm sure that there was, you know, embellishments and all sorts of things going on with the other countries in the Arab uprisings and the people posting things on Twitter and Facebook. But in Syria, it felt like both sides of the game had a pretty good understanding of what the media wanted, and they were playing it. And I found a lot of people who used social media a lot during the Middle Eastern uprisings became a lot more cautious after the Syrian uprising began. And I certainly did. And now I find it very difficult to use social media to report on Syria, but I don't put enough time into it. So it's, you know, there are other people who use it much better than I do now.
Fascinating, Jess, and thanks very much for spending this time with us today to talk about the implications of social media for online news production.
Pleasure.